Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're venturing into a part of history that's often left in the shadows. The story of Japan's female samurai. Warriors who weren't supposed to exist yet fought with the same steel and fire as their male counterparts. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Whether you're tucked into bed, sipping tea, or just looking for a quiet escape, this space is for you. So breathe deep, settle in, and let yourself drift through misty mountains, crumbling castles, and echoes of battle. This is a story the world tried to forget, but tonight it's all yours. In the mist-shrouded folds of Japan's early past, where myth and memory coils like morning fog upon a silent battlefield, there exists the tale of a woman whose legacy would echo for centuries. Sometimes praised, sometimes doubted, but never entirely forgotten. She was Empress Jingu, a figure poised precariously between legend and historical truth. Her name embroidered into the ancient records with the same reverent ambiguity reserved for demigods and warrior kings. The chronicles speak of her not as a footnote, but as a sovereign who once commanded armies, conquered foreign lands, and bore the bloodline of emperors. Whether she truly held a sword, whether she led her fleet across the sea to a distant conquest, remains uncertain. But in the collective mind of Japan, she stood as the earliest specter of something long denied and rarely acknowledged: the woman warrior. The oldest texts to speak of her, the Kaiki and the Nihon Shaki, are not reliable in the way modern scholars demand. Yet they are rich in texture and reverence. They do not hesitate to proclaim that upon the death of her husband, Emperor Choi, this empress gathered the tattered cords of a broken court and wrapped them around her own waist. She is said to have consulted the gods themselves, who whispered secrets of vengeance and glory in her ears, sending her not merely to avenge a fallen emperor, but to establish divine order in lands beyond the sea. It is here that the tale slips from plausible record into whispered epic, for the gods did not guide her back to the interior provinces, but toward the storm-tossed waters of the Korean peninsula. The empress, pregnant with the future emperor, Ojin, is said to have bound her belly tight, donned armor not meant for her form, and led a fleet across the straits to conquer a foreign kingdom with neither bloodshed nor resistance. The enemy, paralyzed by the might of her divine favor, is said to have surrendered without drawing a single blade. Even in the telling, the story feels carved from bronze rather than ink. There is no evidence that such a campaign occurred. No Korean chronicles that record the arrival of a Japanese empress with an unborn son and a fleet of spectral warriors. Yet, the absence of confirmation has never been enough to erase belief. For over 1,000 years, her tale was retold in temples and palaces, recited in battle camps and courtly salons. She was elevated to deity, worshipped as a symbol of national fortitude, and eventually enshrined at Hachiman shrines across the country. In an age when women were expected to fade into the silken confines of domesticity, Empress Jingu rode across the pages of history, not as a consort or mother, but as a conqueror and queen. And yet, for all her grandeur, Jingu's story tells us more about what people wish to believe than what may have actually occurred. Her legend does not stand as proof of an egalitarian society that welcomed women onto the battlefield. Quite the opposite, it remains powerful precisely because it is exceptional. In the centuries that followed, women were not encouraged to follow her path. The sword and the saddle remained the province of men. Jingu became a sacred contradiction, a solitary monument to possibility in a world that increasingly forbade it. She loomed large, not because there were many like her, but because there were so few. She was remembered because history, as it was later written, needed a noble origin to justify its silences. Thus begins the long and winding path of the Honorbuga, the women warriors of Japan, who weren't supposed to exist. Jingu's tale, half myth and half manifesto, cast the first shadow on this forgotten lineage. Whether she ever raised a sword or not, her presence opened a small, stubborn crack in the walls of the tradition. It would be centuries before others followed, and they would not come peacefully. They would arrive with blood on their blades, fire at their backs, and defiance in their hearts. If the tale of Empress Jingu rose like a golden mist from the ancient shores of Yamato, the lives of ordinary women in early feudal Japan were far more earthbound, woven not from legend, but from the unyielding fibers of rice straw, lacquered flaws, and familial obligation. The transition from myth to reality is always a hard road to walk. For every woman clothed in divine purpose and crowned in poetry, there were thousands whose names were never written down, whose hands bore the calluses of labor, and whose loyalty was measured not in battles won, but in the endurance of silence. These were the women of the Bushi households, the Wishireis, daughters and widows of the early samurai class. The emergence of the samurai as a distinct social group was neither sudden nor neat. It was born in fits and starts during the Han period, when the court in Kyoto began to wither beneath the weight of its own ceremonies. As the imperial center turned inward, cloaking itself in poetry, perfume, and political impotence, the outer provinces grew restless. Landowners, local governors, and minor aristocrats armed themselves and turned to violence to settle disputes that once would have been mediated by paper and seal. From this chaos rose the Bushi, the warrior elite, who would eventually dominate Japan for centuries. But in this formative era, the roles of women remained bound tightly to the rhythms of domestic life, even as the clang of steel grew louder in the distance. A woman born into a Bushi family was raised not to fight, but to preserve. She was the keeper of the household, the instructor of servants, the caretaker of children and elderly kin. Her education was practical and philosophical. She learned the art of writing, not to pen chronicles of conquest, but to correspond with other noble families and maintain the fragile threads of alliance. She studied poetry, not as an indulgence, but as a means of expressing restrained emotion within a culture that prized subtlety over confrontation. Her mind was sharpened not for strategy on the battlefield, but for navigating the labyrinthine politics of marriage, inheritance, and honor. Yet, even within this quiet world, she was not wholly unarmed. From an early age, many daughters of the Bushi were trained in the use of weapons, particularly the naginata, a curved polearm suited to both reach and grace. This training was not symbolic. It was a matter of necessity. In times of war, the men of the household might ride off to distant provinces, leaving behind women, children, and retainers to defend the estate. A well-trained woman could buy time, protect servants, and hold the gate long enough for help to arrive. Such moments were rare, but they were not imaginary. The expectation was clear. Though she might never step foot on a battlefield, a samurai woman was to be the last line of defense between her family's legacy and its annihilation. Still, the armor she wore was more often metaphorical. It was made of etiquette, endurance, and quiet discipline. Her courage was tested not in duels or skirmishes, but in childbirth, in the long winters spent managing rations, in the shame of losing a child to sickness, and in the grief of watching a husband return from war, altered beyond recognition. She was expected to be unflinching, yet invisible. Her strength was praised only when it was used to uphold a man's name. If she faltered, she brought dishonor not just upon herself, but upon her ancestors and descendants alike. There were no songs written for her, no chronicles etched into temple stone. She existed in the margins, and it was there that she endured. Despite the rigidity of her role, the early samurai woman was not without influence. In some households, she oversaw financial affairs and estate management in her husband's absence. In others, she taught moral codes and martial discipline to her sons, shaping the next generation of warriors. Her authority was subtle but profound. A skilled mother might mold a boy into a just and loyal vassal. A cunning wife could hold together alliances between fractious clans with little more than well-timed letters and diplomatic gift-giving. And when the time came to defend her family's honor, she was expected to do so with steel. There are records, fleeting, fractured, and rare, of women who took their own lives rather than surrender their homes to invading forces, who dressed in armor to lead servants into defense, who killed their own children before turning the blade upon themselves so that no living soul would bear witness to the family's disgrace. These moments were not celebrated. They were whispered about, passed down quietly from one woman to the next like an heirloom too dangerous to display. And in time, even the whispers began to fade. The chronicles written by monks and statesmen omitted these sacrifices not out of malice, but because they did not know how to place them in the grand narrative of war and power. Women who fought were inconvenient truths in a system built upon the appearance of masculine supremacy, yet they existed not in the grand epics, not in official court annals, but in the fading ink of family scrolls, in the faded lacquer of a battle-worn naginata passed down through daughters, in the tremble of a shrine maiden's voice as she recited the story of an ancestor who once stood with a blade in her hand and dared to defy her fate. It is here in the tension between expectation and defiance that the story of Japan's female warriors truly begins. The age of myth gave them a heroine in the form of Empress Jingu. The age of history sought to bury them beneath layers of custom and silence. But a seed had been planted, and though centuries would pass before it bore fruit, the roots ran deep. In the quiet homes of the samurai, behind painted screens and paper walls, young girls watched their brothers train with swords and bows. And some among them, perhaps only a few, asked why they too could not fight. Their question would not be answered in that age. But the wind was shifting, and war, as it always does, would come again. In the stillness of twilight, when the corridors of the imperial palace in Hanno glowed with the last light of an amber sun, one could almost believe the world beyond those painted screens no longer existed. Within the refined world of the Han aristocracy, time moved like silk through the fingers. Life was measured not in years or wars, but in poems exchanged between lovers, in the subtle placement of a fan, in the delicate ink brushed across scrolls by courtiers, more concerned with wordplay than governance. Beauty was currency and elegance was armor. The men wore robes layered in quiet hues and carried fans rather than swords. The women veiled behind gores and ceremony drifted like moonlight from chamber to chamber. And while the empire seemed at peace, its core was hollowing, its borders left to the mercy of ambition and force. It was during this period, stretching from the 8th century into the 12th, that the illusion of a harmonious and centralized Japan began to fray. The court remained aloof, wrapped in its rituals and romance, while the real world, harsh, demanding, and increasingly lawless, grew restless at the margins. The provinces, long considered the court's distant concern, became the breeding ground for violence. Bandits terrorized villages. Local disputes erupted into skirmishes, and powerful families began to settle their grievances with steel rather than scrolls. With no army to send and no appetite for confrontation, the court began to rely on landholding families to maintain order. In return, those families were granted greater authority over their domains. Thus, through neglect rather than decree, a new class was born. They were not kings or courtiers. They were warriors. They were bushy. At first, they were little more than thugs with titles, provincial toughs, elevated by necessity. They hunted bandits, collected taxes, and upheld their lord's justice with brutal efficiency. But over time, these warriors began to craft for themselves a code, a way of life rooted in discipline, loyalty, and blood. The samurai was not yet a polished figure in lacquered armor, but the mold was being formed. Their loyalty shifted from the distant emperor to their immediate liege. Their lives were no longer governed by court calendars or poetry contests, but by the rhythm of horseback, arrow, and blade. They fought not for beauty or enlightenment, but for land, honor, and survival. The transformation did not come overnight, nor was it celebrated by the capital. In the rare instances when warriors were mentioned in court diaries, it was with disdain, even fear. To the refined nobility of Hanko, the bushi were crude instruments, necessary perhaps, but never to be mistaken for equals. Their armor was loud, their manners coarse, their presence a reminder that outside the capital, the world was unraveling. But while the court clung to its fragile elegance, the provinces grew stronger, and the sword began to speak with a voice the emperor could no longer ignore. For the women of this era, the shift was both distant and immediate. In Hanko, noble women continued to wield soft power behind silk screens, engaging in literary jewels and political matchmaking. Their lives still shaped by poetry and expectation. But outside the capital, in the fortresses and manors of the provinces, the daughters and wives of rising warrior families found themselves living in a world where poetry no longer held the same weight. Their days were shaped by duty and the presence of armed men. They tended to the fields, maintained the estate, and learned to sense the signs of danger. And though few would ever see combat, many were trained in the art of war, not for glory, but for necessity. The naginata became their companion, both a weapon and a symbol. It was taught not as a rite of passage, but as a practical tool, a way to ensure that should their home be breached or their family threatened, they could stand between the intruder and the inner chambers. These women did not call themselves warriors. They did not speak of honor or destiny, but they learned to fight because they had to, because war was creeping closer, and because no one would come to save them. The men rode out with banners and brothers, but the women stayed behind, and they prepared in their own way. What makes this period so haunting is the silence that surrounds these women. We know their names only in fragments, their deeds whispered in temple records or family scrolls, rarely acknowledged by the great compilers of history. They were not the writers of poems or the architects of treaties. They did not dress in 12-layered kimonos or court emperors in moonlit gardens, but they were there watching, waiting, training, holding the line when their homes were left vulnerable. The rising tide of war would not spare them. In a time, it would come for them too. The early Heian period is often remembered as a golden age of Japanese culture, and in many ways it was. Its poetry remains among the finest in world literature. Its aesthetics shaped centuries of art and ceremony, but beneath its beauty, a fracture widened. The court, so devoted to appearances, failed to see that power was shifting. The Bushi were no longer merely servants of the noble houses. They were becoming lords in their own right. They were carving out domains, building alliances, and preparing for war on a scale the capital could not imagine. The rise of the samurai was not a revolution. It was a slow erosion, a tide that pulled away the foundations of imperial rule, grain by grain. And as that tide advanced, the world changed. Men who once measured greatness in verse now found themselves replaced by men who measured it in scars. Castles replaced salons, loyalty replaced charm, and the women, those who had watched silently for so long, began to pick up the weapons they had trained with in private, not as a form of ceremony, but as a preparation for the storms to come. In the final century of the Heian era, the peace that had lulled the court into decadence collapsed into civil war. The Jinni conflict would plunge the country into chaos and decide the future of Japan's warrior class. For the first time in history, armies raised not by the emperor, but by rival samurai clans would battle for control of the nation. And amid that storm, one woman would ride out in armor, not as myth, not as legend, but as fact. Her name would be Tamo, and she would not be alone. The storm did not come all at once. Like all great calamities, it began with tension, with whispers behind silk screens, with the restless shifting of power among clans that had grown too large for their assigned stations. The Taira and the Minamoto, two families of imperial descent, long forced to endure the humiliation of distant provinces and the contempt of court courtiers, had returned to the capital with swords at their sides and ambition in their eyes. They did not beg for favor. They took it. By the end of the 12th century, they no longer existed as mere retainers or vassals. They had become armies unto themselves, and between them lay a kingdom unclaimed. The Jinni War was not a single campaign, but a chain of brutal reckonings stretching from 1180 to 1185. It was a civil war, not in name alone, but in its very nature. Clan against clan, cousin against cousin, all bound by imperial blood and unbound by imperial authority. The emperor, once divine in the eyes of men, now sat in the center of a court, too impotent to stop the fire spreading through its own house. Power had slipped from the hands of poets and monks, and now rested with those who could take it with spear and bow. It began with the rising of Minamoto no Yoritomo, exiled and humiliated after his father's death at the hands of the Taira years earlier. Yoritomo was not a charismatic leader in the mold of kings and conquerors. He was cautious, patient, and slow to trust. But he understood better than most the moment that had come. The Taira, led by Kiyomori, had overstepped. They had filled the court with their kin, pulled the strings of the emperor like puppeteers, and treated the capital like their personal estate. The resentment they inspired among rival families was not only deep, it was explosive. Yoritomo lit the spark, but it was others who carried the flame. The war began in the east and quickly bled westward. Provinces that had once known only the quiet rustling of rice paddies now echoed with the of hooves and the cries of dying men. The Taira controlled the court, the emperor in the seos of the inland sea. But the Minamoto had the mountains, the loyalty of warrior bands, and the cunning of men who had been hunted and survived. From these elements, a new form of power was being born. rough and unpolished, but unstoppable. It was in this maelstrom that Minamoto no Yoshinaka emerged, a man of contradictions, brilliant and reckless, loyal yet insubordinate, a cousin to Yoritomo and a rival to his vision. Yoshinaka was not content to serve quietly in the shadows. He burned with ambition and threw himself into the war with a ferocity that terrified even his allies. His forces surged across central Japan like a flood, defeating the Taira in battle after battle, forcing them into retreat. He did not wait for strategy or orders. He moved like a man possessed, his armor blackened by smoke, his name whispered in both fear and admiration. And riding beside him, dressed in armor not meant for her form, was a woman. But the story of that woman, Tamo, belongs to what comes next. For now, what matters is the world she entered and the blood-soaked path that made her emergence possible. The J-War tore through the social fabric of Japan. It was not merely a struggle between nobles. It was a crucible, melting down old loyalties and reforging new ones. Castles changed hands with every season. Whole villages vanished beneath ash. Temples became fortresses. Priests prayed over swords rather than scriptures. Even the weather seemed to betray the land. Floods, famine, and fire hounded the armies as they marched. Every day, the war dragged on, and every day the rules that had once governed the samurai's place in the world crumbled just a little more. In such times, the exceptional becomes possible, not because it is permitted, but because no one is watching the gate. When fire consumes the house, it no longer matters who was forbidden to carry the water. And so the space opened, small, dangerous, and fleeting, for a woman to take up arms, not in the shadows of a manor, but in the open field of battle. It would not have happened in a time of peace. It would not have been allowed in the well-ordered days of old. But this was no longer a land of order. This was a land of ambition and chaos. And chaos is always fertile soil for the forgotten. Even as the Jini War raged, the concept of what it meant to be samurai was shifting. The romantic image of the noble warrior had not yet taken root. The men who fought in these early battles were often as ruthless as the brigands they opposed. They killed not for glory, but for advantage. They took heads as trophies. They betrayed allies for position. They obeyed the codes they wrote themselves and changed them as needed. And yet, within this brutal and often dishonorable struggle, something enduring began to take shape. A belief that loyalty, courage, and skill should be honored, regardless of lineage or gender. It was not widespread and it was not written down, but it lived in the hearts of men and women who fought not for the court, but for survival. The war would not last forever. Like all storms, it would pass. But the devastation it left behind would redraw the map of Japan forever. The Taira, once the masters of the imperial court, would be hunted to extinction. The Minamoto would rise not merely as victors, but as the architects of a new kind of rule, a military government known as the shogunate. And in the ashes of that transformation, the figure of a female warrior would rise. Not in myth, not in whispers, but in the blood and thunder of actual battle. Her name would be recorded, her deeds recounted. And for the first time since Empress Jingu, a woman would stand at the center of Japan's great wars, not as symbol or servant, but as samurai. The hour was nearly upon her. The battlefield awaited. The Giei War had grown into something monstrous. By the winter of 1183, it no longer bore the lean desperation of a regional feud or the strategic elegance of imperial maneuvering. It had become a beast with many heads thrashing across the archipelago, devouring cities, rivers, temples, and men. The Taira, blood-kin to emperors and former masters of the court, were in retreat. Their crimson banners, once symbols of nobility and untouchable authority, now fluttered like torn silk over scorched fields and broken walls. The Minamoto, emboldened by their momentum and burning with generational fury, had become less an army than a judgment. And at the heart of this firestorm rode Minamoto no Yoshinaka, the man whom fate had chosen to storm the capital and challenge the heavens themselves. Yoshinaka had emerged from the mountains of Shinano like a hawk descending from a pine ridge. His campaign was merciless, swift, and absolute. Where other commanders might have paused to fortify supply lines or establish alliances, Yoshinaka pressed forward with the abandon of a man who did not believe he would live long enough to regret anything. His tactics were wild but effective. He crossed rivers swollen with snowmelt, baited his enemies into impossible terrain, and struck with fury before the echo of his coming could reach their ears. When he captured Kyoto in mid-183, driving the Taira from the capital, he did so not as a conqueror garbed in regal formality, but as a warrior soaked in the mud of battle, the soot of burning gates still fresh on his face. But the capital was no longer a jewel. Kyoto had become a haunted place. The aristocracy had either fled with the Taira or locked themselves behind gilded doors, hoping in vain that the ghosts of court life could be summoned back with incense and song. The common people, caught in the crossfire of titanic ambitions, had learned that allegiance meant little when arrows fell like rain. Temples had been emptied and turned into storehouses. Shrines had been defiled by the war horses. Bridges were burned behind every retreat, and the rivers ran not only with snow, but with the ash of a crumbling order. In this ruin, Yoshinaka made his camp, and beside him stood the woman whose presence would confound future generations of historians and chroniclers. A woman whom no one expected and whom the battlefield could not deny. Tomoe-goen, her name would live far longer than that of most generals. But in this moment, she was not legend. She was a warrior among warriors, clad in armor built for men, but worn by a woman who had trained not for the admiration of poets, but for the reality of battle. The Heike Monogatari, the war epic that recorded the Genie conflict, would later describe her with a breathless reverence that bordered on disbelief. She was said to be especially beautiful, her skin pale and her long black hair trailing behind her like a banner of its own. Yet, it was not her appearance that made men speak her name in hushed tones. It was her skill. She rode into battle with unmatched grace, wielding the curved blade of the samurai with a ferocity that belied her form. She could draw a bow while galloping, strike down foes in single combat, and hold the line against 10 times her number without faltering. Tomoe-goen did not fight in secret. She did not disguise herself or plead for permission. She rode beneath the banner of Yoshinaka with pride, leading troops into battle as any officer might. Her presence was not a curiosity to her fellow soldiers, but a certainty. They had seen her kill. They had watched her cleave men from their saddles in return. Blood on her blade, her expression untroubled. In an army led by a man as unpredictable as Yoshinaka, she was not the strangest thing they had seen. She was simply the most effective. The battles of 1183 and 1184 were brutal in the extreme. The Taira, though driven from Kyoto, were far from defeated. They regrouped in the western provinces and prepared to retake what had been lost. The Minamoto, meanwhile, turned on one another, their unity dissolving in the acid of ambition. Yoshinaka's victory had unsettled his cousin, Yoritomo, who viewed him less as an ally and more as a dangerous rival. Suspicion turned to accusation. Accusation turned to confrontation, and before long, Minamoto was drawn against Minamoto in a bitter contest for control over the very war they had once waged together. In these internet battles, Tomoe-goen remained at Yoshinaka's side. She did not flinch when their allies began to abandon them. She did not question when their position grew desperate. At the Battle of Shinohara, she fought with a grim determination, slaying multiple enemies in close combat. Her armor dented and her horse layered in foam. At times, she was tasked with holding the flank, at others with breaking through enemy lines. She did both with equal precision. No quarter was given, none was asked. By the time of the final confrontation at Awazu in early 1184, Yoshinaka's army had dwindled to a shadow of its former strength. He faced overwhelming odds. Yoritomo had dispatched his brothers, Yoshitsune and Narori, to crush the upstart once and for all. Surrounded and betrayed, Yoshinaka chose to die on his feet. He donned his armor, mounted his steed, and rode out into the storm. Beside him, still unbroken, still ready, rode Tomo. What happened at Awazu would become the stuff of songs and speculation. Tomoe-goen, according to later accounts, fought like a demon. Some say she cut down a famed warrior in single combat, wrestling him from his saddle and severing his head to present as a trophy. Others claim she was ordered to flee by Yoshinaka himself, who wished for her to live, or perhaps to die elsewhere, away from the shame of his own defeat. Whether she obeyed, escaped, or died that day remains uncertain. The records diverge, the poets embroider. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the silence between. But what is certain is that she existed. She fought, She led men into battle and walked through blood and fire with her name spoken in awe, not pity. In a world that made no place for her, she carved one with steel. She did not ask to be remembered. She made it impossible to forget her. She appeared at first like an anomaly, an error in the script of the age, something left behind by an older myth or conjured by the desperation of a collapsing army. Yet Tamo Galzin was no illusion. She was not whispered into being by bars or softened into elegance by the calligraphy of court poets. She was flesh and fury, a woman whose presence on the battlefield was so undeniable, so brutally real, that no amount of disbelief could erase her. While the histories written after her time would often wrap her in the gauze of romance and myth, those who rode beside her did not question what they saw. They saw a warrior. They saw death in the shape of a woman, and they followed her. The name Tamo itself carries echoes of balance and harmony, a symbol once etched into shields and armor to evoke the swirling duality of wind and water, of force and flow. She bore the name well. Her movements were said to be elegant, precise, almost hypnotic, not wild like those of a berserker, but deliberate, practiced, deadly. She did not rely on strength. She relied on speed, control, and a depth of training that betrayed a lifetime spent not merely learning the blade, but mastering it in secret. Far from the formal dojus and warrior schools, where men sharpen their egos as much as their weapons. Her battlefield presence was not ornamental, it was foundational. In the chaos of war, where lesser fighters flailed and flinched, she moved like a hawk through smoke. We know so little of her past. The records do not tell us who trained her, who permitted her to wear armor, who first handed her the curved sword and told her it was hers to wield. It is tempting to imagine a father who raised her as a son, or a master who saw in her something rare and unstoppable. But history offers only fragments. What is known is that she came from a family with ties to the Kiso branch of the Minamoto, and that she likely trained from a young age in the use of bow, blade, and naginata, as some noble daughters did when their households hovered near war. But she was more than a defender of the hearth. She did not remain behind castle gates, guarding the home while the men rode to war. She rode with them and she commanded them. In the Hekemonogatari, the great chronicle of the Jani War, Tomoe is described as a general of Yoshinaka's army, commanding her own contingent of men and fighting in the thick of battle. While later versions of her story often soften her role, depicting her as a loyal concubine, a tragic widow, or a wandering nun seeking redemption. The earliest accounts treat her as a soldier. She did not plead for entry into the ranks. She was already there. When she took a head in combat, it was not a symbolic gesture. It was war. She killed to win, and she killed cleanly. What made her so unsettling to later chroniclers, even as they admired her, was not just that she fought, it was that she excelled. She was not a novelty. She was not an ornament upon the battlefield. She was victorious. Men died at her hands, not in some remote defensive action, not in the defense of a manor during siege, but on the open field, in the brutal press of cavalry and steel. The idea that a woman could ride into such a scene and leave it alive, let alone triumphant, was something the culture could not fully digest. And so in time, her story would be adjusted, dulled at the edges, rendered symbolic, tragic, poetic. But the facts do not lie. At the Battle of Awazu, when Yoshinaka's army was being crushed beneath the hooves of his cousin's vanguard, Tomoe Galzin was not hiding in a pavilion. She was riding through the enemy ranks, cutting her way through the storm like a blade through silk. Her final recorded act in the war is told with both awe and confusion. Some say Yoshinaka, moments before his death, commanded her to leave the field, not because he questioned her loyalty, but because he feared the shame of dying alongside a woman. Others say he wanted her to live, to carry his legacy forward in exile. Still others claim she refused, fought one last time, and vanished into history. One story tells of her taking the head of a great warrior named An no Hiro before fleeing. Another says she joined a convent, forever haunted by what she had seen and done. Yet another, less often told, but no less poetic, claims she returned to the mountains, living out her days training girls in secret, passing on the art of war in quiet defiance of a world that had no place for her. Whatever the truth, it is clear that Tamogozin did not die at Awazu. She was not cut down in some anonymous skirmish, nor was she taken as a trophy by the victors. She slipped through Rome, through the net as if the gods themselves were unwilling to let her end be written by anyone else. Her survival only deepened her legend, giving her the kind of lingering power that haunts a culture. She became a question rather than an answer, a challenge rather than a conclusion. And yet, even in the face of such achievement, the reaction of history was telling. No other woman is recorded in such detail during the Genie War. None before her stood in quite the same light, and none after her would be permitted to again for many generations. It is as though the world, shocked by what it had seen, hurried to pretend it had not happened. Tomoe was celebrated, yes, immortalized in paintings and plays, but always with a certain distance, as if her presence was too dangerous to accept fully. She was remembered not as a herald of a new era, but as a strange exception, a curious chapter in a book that quickly turned its page. But she had ridden, she had fought, and she had killed. That cannot be undone. In the long arc of Japan's warrior tradition, she stands like a solitary torch in the dark, a flame not of myth but of memory. And for every girl who heard whispers of her name, for every woman who stood before a weapon and wondered if it might be hers to wield, Tarogasin was there in steel, in silence, in defiance. She had stood where no woman was meant to stand, and she had not yielded. The war had ended, or so they said. The banners had been lowered, the war horses unsaddled, and the headless corpses scattered across hills and riverbeds had been given their rights or left for crows. The Genie War in all its carnage and fury had reshaped the land, not only with blood, but with permanence. The Taira were no more. The court had been hollowed out, its velvet silks and perfumed corridors now haunted by the ghosts of a power it had squandered. The emperor still reigned, but only in name. The true power had shifted quietly and absolutely into the hands of the warriors. And at the center of this new world stood Minamoto, no Yoritomo, brother to the poet, cousin to the rebel. A man who had won the war not by sword alone, but by patience, ruthlessness, and timing. Yoritomo did not claim the imperial throne. That would have been heresy. Instead, he left the illusion of sovereignty intact and constructed his own seat of power far from the capital in Kamakura, a coastal town carved into cliffs and mist. There he built something new, something that Japan had never seen before. He called it the Bakufu, the tent government, a phrase born from the field camps of military commanders, but now applied to the machinery of state itself. In practice, it was a shogunate, a government ruled not by divine lineage or scholarly bureaucracy, but by the authority of arms. The age of the court was over. The age of the warrior had begun. But though the war was over, peace did not settle gently across the land. There were debts to pay, lands to divide, wounds to reopen, and ambitions to suppress. The Minamoto clan had triumphed, but its unity was an illusion. Brothers eyed each other with suspicion. Allies from the war became threats in peace. Even Yoritomo, seated now at the pinnacle of power, ruled with the knowledge that loyalty purchased in wartime often soured when the spoils were divided. He was not a man given to trust, and so he ruled not as a liberator or visionary, but as a tactician, cautious, calculating, and unyielding. It was in this uneasy stillness that the role of women within samurai society began to calcify. During the war, as the old structures buckled and flames swept across the provinces, there had been moments, brief and unsanctioned, when women had stepped forward, taken up arms, and made history. Tomo Gozen had ridden into battle, not as an outlier of gender, but as a necessity of chaos. But chaos had passed. In its place came order, and order had no place for unpredictability. The new samurai elite, forged in fire but now clothed in robes of law and inheritance, began to shape a society that valued discipline above daring. Women were given their place, honored in theory, constrained in practice. The martial training that had once been practical became symbolic. The naginata was still taught to daughters of noble households, but it was now more emblem than armament, a gesture of tradition rather than preparation. A woman might still be praised for loyalty, for self-sacrifice, for dying in defense of her household. But to fight alongside men in open warfare, That door, once cracked open by necessity, was closing again. Yet the spirit of defiance, once awakened, does not sleep easily. The memory of Tomo Gozen lingered not as an accepted truth, but as a whisper that stirred when the wind changed. And in the shadows of Kamakura, another figure was rising. Not a warrior in armor, but a woman of strategy, of will, and of political brilliance. Her name was Hojo Masako, and she was Yoritomo's wife. She had not ridden into battle. She had not raised a sword. But she would wield power in a way no woman before her had ever done. She would rule not from behind a screen, but from the front of the council chamber. But her story belongs to another part of this chapter. For now, it is enough to understand that even in peace, even under the boot of a system built to silence them, women found ways to act, to shape, and to survive. The Kamakura period would become known for its rigid structures, its devotion to martial codes, and its growing distance from the fluid poetic world of Heian. In this new world, women were expected to become the stewards of family honor, the caretakers of legacy, the preservers of lineage. Their courage was to be shown in silence, their loyalty in obedience. But still, in some corners of the provinces, in manors surrounded by forest and mows, young girls trained in the arts of war, quietly, patiently. The world might not allow them a battlefield, but they would be ready if one found them, because the truth was simple and eternal. War did not end. It only changed its shape, and sooner or later the storm would return. The Kamakura shogunate, having seized power through blood and fire, had no appetite for chaos. It sought stability above all else, stability through hierarchy, through order, through a rigid understanding of who ruled, who served, and who was allowed to vanish into quiet domesticity. For the warriors, it was a golden cage. They were powerful now, but only so long as they obeyed the system they had helped build. For women, the cage had no gilding. Their world narrowed. Even the faintest memory of female warriors on horseback was slowly being folded into legend, wrapped in scrolls of theater and romance. Safe and distant, but not everyone was content to be forgotten. In the year 1201, only 18 years after the Genie War ended, the earth shook once more. The court noble Joe and his allies launched a rebellion against the Kamakura shogunate, hoping to reclaim power for the emperor and strip it from the hands of the military government. Among those who took up the call was the Ichigo clan in the northern province, fierce and proud retainers who still burned with resentment at the rule of distant lords. And among their warriors stood a woman named Hangaku Goen. Her name was not as famous as Tomo's. Her deeds were not embroidered into epics recited by monks and courtiers. But for those who fought beside her and for those who survived her final battle, there was no forgetting what they had seen. She was tall by the reports. Beautiful, some said, though the word rings hollow in the context of battle. She wore armor with the confidence of one who had not merely borrowed it, but earned it. Her hair was said to be tied high beneath her helmet, her eyes steady, her grip on her bow without tremor. When the rebellion reached its peak, Hengaku was entrusted with the defense of Torisaka Castle, a key position, a choke point, a place that must not fall. Her forces numbered fewer than 300. The enemy sent against her was 3,000 strong. It was not a battle. It was a siege, a test, a death sentence. And she accepted it without hesitation. She did not beg for mercy. She did not defer to a man. She commanded. She oversaw the archers on the walls, chose the placement of barricades, walked the battlements in full armor, and stood in the line of fire. Her voice rose above the clash and the cries. When her men wavered, it was she who steadied them. When the enemy drew near, it was she who took up her bow. Her arrows finding their marks one after another as if guided by the spirits of war themselves. For days they held the defenders, though vastly outnumbered, fought with the madness of the cornered and the doomed. They inflicted heavy losses. They made the enemy bleed for every inch of ground. Hangaku, standing tall upon the ramparts, seemed untouchable. Arrows flew around her like summer hail. She did not flinch. Her presence became a kind of myth within the battle itself. Soldiers spoke of her as if she were more than human. An avatar of vengeance, an echo of the old gods who once granted Empress Jingu her vision of conquest. But no defense lasts forever. An arrow found its mark, piercing her thigh and bringing her to the ground. She did not cry out, she did not surrender. But her injury forced her from the wall, and the defenders lost their light. The enemy breached the gates, and the battle ended in blood and ash. Hangaku Gaozen was taken alive, wounded, defeated, but unbroken. What followed was not execution as many expected. Her defiance had earned the grudging respect of her captors. They brought her to Kamakura, where her presence in chains caused a stir among the city's samurai and courtiers. Some were disgusted, others were aruck. One high-ranking samurai, said to be taken by her beauty and valor, asked for her hand in marriage. Whether it was love, mercy, or political calculation, Hangaku was pardoned and wed into a prominent family. From that point onward, her story fades. The records grow thin. She disappears from the chronicles. Her name swallowed by the silence that waits for all who no longer serve a purpose to power. Yet the image remains. A woman in full armor, bleeding on the stone, her bow still in her hands, her eyes fixed on the enemy as they closed in. Hangaku Gaozen did not fight for glory. She did not fight to be remembered. She fought because she believed in something greater than obedience. She fought because the shogunate had drawn its lines too sharply, carved its roles too deeply, and someone had to stand outside them, even if only for a moment. Like Tomo before her, she would not spark a movement. She would not change the system. Her defiance would not be taught in schools or etched into the tales told to daughters of the Bushi, but her stand carved a scar into the surface of history. It reminded the world even briefly that the silence of women was not always willing, and that beneath the masks of duty and grace, there still burned a will to resist. And that sometimes is enough. It began slowly, as decay always does. A province here, a rebellion there, a vassal who no longer sent tribute, a temple raised by men who claimed no lord. The shogunate in Kamakura had long since lost the fire that forged it. It had become brittle, ceremonial, rotted through with nepotism and fear. When the Ashikaga took power and established a second shogunate in Kyoto, they claimed the mantle of order. But it was a lie whispered into the void. The land was already slipping from their fingers. By the mid-15th century, Japan was no longer a country governed by law. It was 1,000 fractured ambitions stitched together by violence. The Sengoku Jedi, the age of warring states, had begun. It would last over a century. In that time, Japan became a graveyard of alliances, a crucible of warlords, and a testing ground for every kind of brutality. Castles were built not as symbols, but as necessities. Fortresses crowned hills and coiled around valleys like stone serpents. Daimyo, the regional lords who once bowed their heads to shoguns and emperors, now made their own laws, their own armies, their own dreams of conquest. Some were men of vision. Most were not. They ruled by steel and died by it. Armies marched not in pairs of thousands, but tens of thousands. Battles lasted for days. Cities burned. Whole provinces vanished into smoke and ash. And amid this cataclysm, women began to rise again, not as relics of a forgotten era, but as participants in the new order of blood. There had been no decree, no official call to arms for women, but war, relentless and unforgiving, cared little for propriety. In the chaos of the Sengoku era, when husbands rode off and never returned, when castles found themselves surrounded before messengers could be sent, when the enemy arrived not next month but by sunrise, the women left behind could no longer afford to wait. They trained, they fought, they led. And for the first time since Tomoe and Hangaku, the presence of women on the battlefield became something more than legend. It became necessity. They were known as Onna Bugasha, female warriors born of noble blood, raised in the customs of Bushido, and trained in the arts of war. Some remained behind gates, defending homes in times of siege. Others took to the battlefield. Most of their names were never recorded, their deeds overshadowed by the generals they fought for or against. But still, evidence of them lingers, not only in dusty scrolls, but in the earth itself. On a battlefield near Senbon Matsubara, bones were found. Of the 105 skeletons unearthed, 35 were women. They had not died by fire or accident. They bore the marks of swords, arrows, and spearheads. They had fought, and they had fallen. Their presence, denied by historians for generations, was undeniable in the dirt. What made this period different was not simply that women fought, but that the circumstances made their fighting unremarkable. No epic songs were written for them. No chroniclers paused to marvel at their courage. The times were too savage for wonder. If a woman could hold a wall against an invading force, she did. If she could fire a matchlock rifle, she was handed one. If she could command servants and militia in the absence of her husband, she was expected to. The lines that had once been drawn so firmly between duty and defiance, between femininity and ferocity, were blurred until they vanished. Survival did not care what name you were called or what clothes you wore. It cared only for what you could do. In some castles, the wives of lords did more than just oversee the defense. They organized strategy, directed fire, punished cowardice. Their authority was not ceremonial. It was absolute. When men fell, women stepped forward. When morale broke, it was often women who held the line. Their weapon of choice remained the naginata, a polearm well suited to their stature and reach. But some learned to use swords, bows, and even firearms as the times demanded. And while their purpose was often framed as defensive, protecting the household, guarding the family name, the reality was far more complex. These were not passive guardians. They were active agents in a war that refused to spare anyone. In this period, war became the common language of all classes, and women, once silenced, were forced to speak it fluently. They trained not in hidden courtyards, but in open fields. They did not hide their armor. They hung it beside their husbands. Mothers taught their daughters not just how to walk and speak, but how to strike and endure. And while the shogunate still clung to old narratives of decorum and propriety, the provinces no longer obeyed. They could not afford to. War had reshaped the code of honor to include whoever could carry it. Yet even amid this bloodletting, there was no coordinated movement, no sisterhood of arms. These women fought in isolation, often unknown to one another. Their courage localized and unseal-braided. Each fortress had its own defenders, each castle its own desperate heroes. They were not fighting for an idea of equality. They were fighting because they were needed. They stepped into roles that no one else could fill. And when the siege ended, when the walls fell or the enemy fled, they often stepped back into silence. Their swords were cleaned, stored, handed down with no ceremony. Their names rarely reached the records, but in every province there were those who remembered. Servants who had seen their mistress take the gatehouse with a spear in hand. Children who recalled the sound of their mother's war cry in the courtyard. Memory clung to them like frost on a battlefield, silent, cold, and enduring. The Sengoku Jedi was not kind to anyone. It devoured men and women alike. But in its cruelty, it offered something the more ordered periods did not. Space. A terrible blood-soaked space where the rules no longer applied, and the impossible became merely improbable. And within that space, a new kind of woman emerged, not hidden, not mythical, but present, armored, and capable. They were not called heroes. They were not invited into the halls of governance. But when the banners rose and the torches were lit, they stood and they did not break. In an age when castles burned like paper and loyalty snapped like brittle pine, it was easy to vanish. Even the greatest warriors could be swept away by one wrong decision, one unlucky siege, one betrayal whispered too late to be heard. And yet, amid this maelstrom, a handful of women stood not only as survivors, but as leaders. They did not wait for history to notice them. They carved their names into it with matchlocks and banners, with letters penned in ash and blood. They were not the last to fight, nor the first, but in the chaos of the Sengoku age, they became necessary in ways the world had not prepared for. Among the most formidable was Tachibana Ginshio, born into the warrior nobility of Kyushu, and heir to the powerful Tachibana clan. She did not take power through marriage or accident. She was appointed clan head at a young age by her father, who saw in her not a liability, but a legacy, in a world still chained to inheritance by bloodlines in masculine succession. This was a seismic gesture, but her appointment was not symbolic. Ginshio governed her domain with full authority, issuing edicts, commanding troops, and preparing for war as any daimyo would. She trained a guard composed entirely of women, retainers, and household staff who drilled in formation, practiced archery, and handled firearms with the same discipline expected of any Ashigaru foot soldier. These were not maid servants. They were a militia in silk sleeves and lacquered cuirasses, a warning to any would-be invader that the Tachibana domain would not be easily claimed. She did not wage war as an abstraction. In 1586, when the Shimazu clan launched a campaign across Kyushu, bringing fire and steel to every province in their path, Ginshio did not retreat. She manned the defenses, supervised the supply chains, coordinated attacks, and took command of her family's stronghold. Her castle did not fall easily, and even when strategic alliances led to her marrying into another clan, essentially trading one battlefield for another, she remained a presence no man could ignore. Her leadership marked her as a rarity, but not an aberration. In the Sengoku Jedi, authority belonged to those who could hold it. Another woman, Kamatsu, moved through this war-torn world like a blade concealed in silk. Daughter of the fearsome General Honda Tadakatsu and wife to San Nuyuki, she was raised in the shadow of war and taught from childhood that loyalty was not a passive virtue, but a practiced one. She bore the elegance of courtly refinement, but beneath her kimono was the steel of conviction. During one of the many fractious moments that marked the end of the 16th century, her husband's father and brother, both sworn to the opposing Tokugawa cause, arrived unannounced at the gates of her castle. She refused them entry, not with weeping or wailing, but with armed guards and formal declaration. Her loyalty was not to blood, but to principle. Her castle would not fall to persuasion or sentiment. These moments, standoffs at gatehouses, barges launched from women's commands, militias led by lacquered sleeves and measured eyes, do not often appear in the grand chronicles of Japan. The annals of the Sengoku age are thick with the names of male daimyo, with maps redrawn by every clash of spear and flame, with lineage charts that swell and vanish with each battle. But in the spaces between those lines, women were governing, defending, deciding. They were not placeholders or relics. They were generals in all but name. One of the oldest and most storied examples is Akai Taruko, a warrior matriarch who lived into her 90s and is said to have fought in dozens of conflicts. She defended her clan stronghold from overwhelming forces with nothing more than cunning, determination, and an army of farmers and house guards were molded by necessity into soldiers. Even in her old age, she was rumored to carry a sword by her side and oversee the training of new troops. Her legacy was not written in legend, but in the continued survival of her house long after younger men had fallen. She endured, and in enduring, she shaped history. What makes these women extraordinary is not simply that they fought. Others did that too. It is that they led. They bore the weight of command. They made decisions that risked everything. Not as advisors, not as symbols, but as sovereigns within their walls. And though they were often framed by their contemporaries as exceptional, too rare to be considered dangerous to the established order, the truth is more complicated. These women were not meteorites blazing across a dark sky. They were mountains rising from a shifting earth. Their strength did not appear suddenly. It was drawn from generations of women who had trained in silence, who had prepared for a war that never arrived, who had passed on their weapons not in defiance, but in hope. The age they lived in was brutal and brief. When peace returned, many of these names would be folded into the quiet oblivion of family records and temple registries. Their castles would be handed to husbands or sons, their guards disbanded, their stories rewritten as noble sacrifices rather than deliberate achievements. But the memory endured in the villages below those strongholds, in the ashes of letters never delivered, in the lineages of women who still trained with weapons passed down as heirlooms. The legend remained, not in stone monuments, but in the marrow of a nation still shaped by war. They were called on bugas, warrior women, but they were more than that. They were matriarchs of steel, commanders of households that became fortresses, keepers of legacies that refused to die. And in the age of endless war, when every dawn could bring fire, they stood, sometimes alone, often unacknowledged, but always unbroken. The dream of peace was nearly within reach, but it would not arrive without blood. After more than a century of ceaseless war, of shifting alliances and butchered loyalties, of sons killing fathers and provinces left to smolder in ash, Japan stood at the edge of something unfamiliar: unity. The work had begun under Oda Nobunaga, been carried through with ruthless precision by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and was now drawing to its bitter conclusion under Tokugawa Ieyasu, the old wolf of the East. But unity, like empire, is rarely accepted. It must be enforced. And there, standing in the path of the Tokugawa's rising sun, was a single fortress, a single family, a single woman who would not surrender. Her name was Yoda Dono, and her place in the Chronicle of Japan is both revered and reviled. Daughter of one great warlord, concubine to another, mother to the last obstacle standing in Ieyasu's way. She was a woman whose life had been shaped by fire from the moment of her birth. Her father, Azai Nagamasa, had died when she was still a girl, his castle crushed beneath the heel of Nobunaga's campaign. Her mother, Oichi, had chosen death over submission. Yodono learned early that women in war were not ornaments or spectators. They were symbols, prizes, liabilities, and sometimes leaders. She carried the weight of that lesson into adulthood like a hidden dagger. After Hideyoshi's death, his infant son, Hideyori, became the heir to a crumbling dream. Too young to rule, too important to ignore, he became both puppet and powder keg. And Yodono, his mother, became the only force standing between her son and the ambitions of men who sought to erase him. She was not a general. She was not a fighter, but she knew power when she saw it, and she understood how to wield what little remained to her. From within the stone labyrinth of Osaka Castle, she built a court of loyal retainers, marshaled her son's allies, and played the delicate, deadly game of feudal politics as if it were a shogi board set on fire. Osaka Castle was no ordinary fortress. It was the grandest in Japan, a marvel of engineering and ambition, built by Hideyoshi himself to serve not merely as a stronghold, but as a statement. It rose above the plains like a mountain with battlements, its moats deep enough to drown armies, its walls thick enough to defy cannon fire. Within its keep, Yodono gathered not only warriors but artisans, scholars, merchants, and loyalists, all of them unwilling to bow before the Tokugawa. And when the demands came, veiled in courtesy for Hideyori to submit, she refused. There would be no surrender, no quiet exile, no peaceful end. The war would come, and it would come to Akka. The siege began in the winter of 1614 under gray skies and winds that blew cold from the mountains. Tokugawa's armies encircled the city like a tightening noose. More than 200,000 men, veterans of countless campaigns, armed with the newest weapons and the coldest discipline. Inside, the defenders numbered half that, maybe less. But their walls were strong, their spirits defiant, and their commander, though never called one by name, was Yodo Dono. She did not lead charges across the battlefield. She did not ride out with a sword at her side, but her influence shaped every decision made within those walls. She rallied the retainers who still believed in the Toyotomi name. She organized supplies, oversaw communication, and refused every offer of clemency. She knew what awaited her son if he fell into Tokugawa hands. She had seen the mercy of conquerors before. She had buried too many to believe in it now. The winter siege dragged on for months. Cannon fire shook the earth. Arrows blackened the skies. Fires lit the night like false dawns, but Osaka held. The defenders repelled assault after assault, sending Tokugawa's forces into retreat, bruised and humiliated. It was an astonishing resistance, one that shook the confidence of the unifier himself. And so, as winter thawed into spring, Ieyasu turned to deceit. A truce was offered. Promises were made. The outer moat would be filled in, he said, but the inner castle would be spared. There would be peace, there would be mercy. Yodono, weary but not blind, knew the nature of such promises. But she also knew that her son, barely more than a boy, longed for resolution. Against her instincts, she agreed to the terms. The outer moat was filled, then the inner. Then before anyone could stop it, the soldiers returned. The truce had been a mask, and when they came again, they came not to besiege, but to exterminate. In the summer of 1615, Osaka burned. The final assault was overwhelming. The walls, now vulnerable, collapsed under bombardment. Fires swept through the wooden structures. The screams of women and children filled the air, cut through by the shrill cries of Ishigaru and the clash of steel on stone. Amidst the ruin, Yodono was seen one last time. Her armor ceremonial, her eyes unwavering. She had refused to flee. She had chosen to die with her son within the last sanctuary of a broken legacy. They perished together, their bodies never recovered, swallowed by flame and memory. With their deaths, the Toyotomi line ended, and Tokugawa's rule became absolute. Japan would know no major war for over 200 years. The age of the honor bugisha, of women who bore steel as well as sorrow, was finished. And yet Yodono's defiance lingers. She had no army of her own, no title, no swordsmanship, no recorded kills. But she stood in the face of empire and said no. She made the unifier bleed. She made the shogunate tremble. And she did it all from behind the walls of a castle that had already been written off as lost. She fought with what she had, and in the end, she made them burn for it. When the smoke finally cleared from the charred husk of Osaka Castle, the war was not only over, it was erased. The Toyotomi were no more. The banners that once snapped above stone towers, inked with the crests of proud houses now burned to ash, were folded away or destroyed. Survivors were hunted, records were rewritten, and those who had stood at the gates, who had defied the encircling storm until their bones were dust and their blood ran black on the courtyard stones, were spoken of only in whispers. Peace had come, but not the kind born from reconciliation. This was not the quiet of harmony. It was the quiet of suppression, of finality. The age of the warrior woman did not end in a flourish of shriniom or the final cry of a dying general. It ended in silence, unspoken, unwritten, but absolute. The Tokugawa shogunate, born in fire and cemented in betrayal, understood that unity required more than victory. It required control. And control was maintained not through terror alone, but through structure, through rigid codes of behavior, lineage, and obedience. Samurai became administrators. Daimyo became governors. Castles were regulated. Weapons cataloged. Travel monitored. Even the clothes one wore, the number of men one could employ, the marriages one could arrange, all were dictated by the new regime. And at the center of it, all stood a shogun who had survived 100 battles, but feared the unpredictable nature of ambition more than any blade. In this new order, there was no place for women like Tomoe, or Hangaku, or Ginshio, or Yodono. Their existence had been forged in war, legitimized by chaos and tolerated by necessity. But now that necessity was gone, the sword was sheathed and the hand that held it was guided into domesticity. The honor buga became a relic, honored in form but not in function, preserved like a lacquered helmet in a museum no longer meant to be worn. The Edo period, as it came to be called, would last for more than 2 centuries. And in that time, women were systematically rewritten. Their roles were codified with precision, framed through Confucian ideals imported from China, and refined to suit a society obsessed with order. A woman was expected to be obedient to her father in youth, to her husband in marriage, and to her son in widowhood. Her virtue lay in submission. Her strength was reimagined not as resistance, but as resilience, the kind that endured in silence, not the kind that stood at a castle wall and fired a rifle into the teeth of an advancing army. But even in this era of enforced peace, the memory of the warrior woman did not die. It lived on in the martial schools where daughters of samurai were still taught the naginata, not as a tool of warfare, but as a symbol of grace and readiness, something elegant and defensive, suitable for women to wield, but never to use. It lived in stories told by grandmothers to their grandchildren, stories of a great aunt who had once held off a band of marauders, of an ancestor who had disguised herself as a man to avenge her brother, of a family sword passed down from mother to daughter, polished but never drawn. These stories were not part of the official record. They were not taught in schools or written into the histories compiled by state-appointed scholars, but they endured in shadow like moss clinging to the underside of stone. The women of the Edo period did not stop being brave. They did not stop dreaming or resisting or surviving. They simply did so in a world that no longer wanted to see them do it. The battlefield was gone. The armor had been taken, but the memory remained, stubborn, silent, and waiting. And in every generation there were those who remembered, the girls who stood a little longer in front of the family shrine, staring at the dusty naginata. The young women who read the old tales by lantern light and wondered whether they too might have ridden into battle had they been born sooner. The widows who watched their sons go off to serve a master they did not believe in and bit back every scream with a grace learned through centuries of repression. The warrior spirit had not been extinguished. It had been buried deep beneath layers of etiquette and submission, like a blade wrapped in silk. The siege of Osaka marked the end of the age of open defiance. From that moment forward, women were no longer permitted to be dangerous. And yet, they had been, and that truth, quiet, inconvenient, undeniable, could not be unmade. History, as written by the victors, often smooths over the jagged edges of reality. It offers a version of the past that serves the present. And so the stories of women who once ruled clans, defended castles, and fought beside men in fields strewn with bodies were quietly folded into legend. Their names were softened, their motives romanticized, their actions questioned. But if one digs deep enough past the official scrolls and sanctioned accounts, one still finds them. And though the era had closed, though the shogunate's peace had covered the land like a heavy snowfall, there was a kind of defiance in the silence. For somewhere beyond the reach of the senses and the scribes, a girl was still being taught to hold a blade. Not because she was expected to fight, but because someone remembered a time when she could. The swords had fallen still, and with them the songs. Where once warlords had ridden out beneath clouds of banners and thunder, there were now processions of lacquered carts and silk umbrellas. The cities no longer burned. The castles no longer changed hands with every rising sun. And in the great palaces of Edo, the shogun reigned from a throne built not of blood, but of law. It was the 17th century, and Japan had entered the long-breathing stillness of the Tokugawa peace. But peace, like war, is never simple. It is not merely the absence of violence, but the architecture of its suppression. And the world that Tokugawa built was not a garden. It was a cage dressed in flowers. Its beauty was undeniable, its precision unmatched. Every aspect of society was weighed, measured, assigned, and bound. The country was divided into domains, each ruled by a daimyo loyal to the shogunate, each required to leave hostages in Edo and to spend half their life in ceremonial attendance. Roads were patrolled, ports were closed, commerce flowed, art flourished, and beneath it all lay a silence so complete that one could hear the echoes of a past that had not yet entirely faded. In this silence lived the daughters of the samurai. They were born into households built on tradition, where every scroll was dusted, every step measured, every word taught with the weight of generations. Their fathers wore two swords, but most never drew them. Their mothers carried themselves with grace, kept the accounts, arranged the marriages, and watched with unspoken vigilance the training of their sons. For a girl born into this world, life followed a strict and narrow path. She was not expected to ride into battle. She would never lead a castle's defense. But neither was she weak. From the moment she could stand straight, she was taught to serve her family with the same loyalty and severity once demanded of warriors. Among her lessons, one stood out: the naginata. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a long curved blade mounted on a staff. Elegant and sweeping, it was often said to suit a woman's reach and movement better than the short katana of men. But by the Edo period, it had become something else entirely: a ritual object, a tool of posture and preparedness, more often seen in training halls than on battlefields. Girls of samurai households were expected to learn it as part of their education. They practiced the forms, memorized the footwork, sparred beneath the watchful eyes of instructors who praised grace more than force. They wore white training robes and moved like dancers, precise and silent. But in the deep corners of those training halls, one could still catch glimpses of something older. A sudden flare of aggression in a sparring match, a bruise hidden beneath the sleeve. A moment when a girl struck, not because she had to, but because something in her demanded to. These were the embers of an age that refused to die completely. Outside the estate walls, the world changed. Towns grew larger, merchants gained power, and wealth no longer belonged solely to the warrior class. But the samurai clung to their identity like a relic. They were poor in coin often, but rich in history, and that history demanded a careful performance. Every family had a genealogy, every child a name chosen with care. Mothers ensured their daughters carried the weight of the family's reputation as if it were armor. Their marriages were arranged not for love, but for strategy. Their behavior reflected not just on themselves, but on every ancestor carved into the family shrine. The Honorabia, the female warrior, had not disappeared, but she had been bound in ritual. She existed now in calligraphy and drama. Kabuki plays retold the stories of Tomoe Gozen and Hengaku Gozen, but always with flourishes and tragedy, often reducing them to symbols of loyalty, feminine courage, or romantic sacrifice. The edge of their stories had been dulled. They were remembered, but only in ways that made them safe. Yet the training continued in every castle town, in private courtyards behind high walls. Girls practiced with the naginata. They studied Confucian texts and wrote poetry. But they also learned how to fight. When asked, instructors would insist it was merely a tradition, a way to teach discipline, posture, poise. But tradition is a strange thing. It often remembers what history forgets. And when unrest stirred, when bandits struck or uprisings flared in remote provinces, there were always a few households where the women stood ready before the men returned. Not every family permitted it. In many homes, daughters were taught only to bow, to serve tea, to prepare themselves for marriage. But in some, the old ways lingered. Stories were told in low voices. Ancestral armor was polished once a year, even if no one ever wore it. Mothers passed on teachings that had never been written down. How to hold a blade, where to strike, when to run. These were not gestures of rebellion. They were acts of remembrance. Because even in peace, danger remained. It always does. And in the quiet heart of the Edo period, beneath the layers of order and obedience, the memory of war still whispered in the blood of those who had once fought it. Women in this era did not dream of glory. They were not praised for defiance, but they carried something heavier, a duty wrapped in silence. They lived in a world that asked them to forget the past, to smile beneath the weight of vanished freedoms. And yet, behind the closed doors of their chambers, in the precise arcs of their naginata drills, they remembered. They remembered what it meant to stand alone, to protect, to endure. And though they were no longer called warriors, they had never stopped being one. There is a peculiar silence that settles over a battlefield long after the swords have been buried. Grass grows over the trenches. Trees take root in the shattered earth. The wind forgets the cries, but something lingers. Something not quite sound, not quite memory, but unmistakably present. The Edo period was covered in that kind of silence. It was a peace so vast and so carefully tended that even the ghosts had to speak softly. And yet, there were stories. Always there are stories. By the middle of the Tokugawa era, the figure of the woman warrior had become less a presence and more a symbol, a silhouette in painted scrolls, a character in popular drama, a whisper from the edge of the page. In kabuki theaters and bunraku puppet plays, audiences watched as heroines like Tommy Goen were transformed from flesh and blood warriors into tragic muses. She no longer rode into battle with blood on her blade. Now she wept for lost love or died beautifully in the name of loyalty. Her armor gleamed, but it no longer bore weight. Her strength had been repackaged into something poetic, something ornamental. And still the people watched. They clutched their sleeves when she appeared on stage. They leaned forward when she raised her sword. They cried when she died. Whether they knew it or not, they were mourning something real, something their world no longer allowed. The state, for its part, tolerated these legends. They were safe now. They no longer threatened the structure of society. They no longer implied possibility. A woman in armor on the stage was just that, a performance, an echo. But in homes where the stories were passed from generation to generation, the edges of the legend remained sharp. In private rooms and faded loves, mothers still told their daughters of ancestors who had once defended castles. Grandmothers spoke of widows who took up arms in the night. And though the lessons had been folded into etiquette and ritual, they still bore the shape of resistance. There were families, quiet, proud families, who displayed their women's armor beside the men's, not in museums, but in the household kamodana, the family shrine. A naginata wrapped in red cloth, a helmet lacquered in black and gold, too small to fit a man's head. A pair of waji sandals never worn since the siege of a castle now long erased from the maps. These objects were not spoken of loudly, but their presence was deliberate, a silent lineage of defiance and duty. For many young women, especially those born into minor samurai households in the provinces, the figure of the Honorbuga lived not in history books. Those were reserved for men, but in labas and proverbs, in quiet rituals performed when no one else was watching. Before exams, some girls would bow toward the ancestral blade. Before marriage, a mother might show her daughter how to draw it, not for use, but to know that it was there, to know that it had been wielded once, that it could be again. The tension of the age was never far from the surface. The shogunate had enforced a peace so strict, so ritualized, that even thoughts had to be disciplined. But thought is a wild thing, memory even more so. And in a country ruled by ceremony, the image of the armored woman was too beautiful to kill, too haunting to ignore. So the Tokugawa regime did what all great powers do when confronted with inconvenient truths. They turned her into art. In a Makamono picture scrolls, she was portrayed kneeling in prayer, her blade at her side. In woodblock prints, she was shown on horseback, her hair flowing, her posture perfect. In kabuki, she danced before she died, her courage stylized into elegance, and the people in their longing accepted these versions. They wept not for the woman, but for what she represented, the possibility that there had once been another way. There was no revolution. There was no rebellion of women tearing off their silks and reclaiming the battlefield. But neither was there surrender. The spirit of the honor Biyashia retreated. Yes, but it did not vanish. It became something quieter, something slower. It settled into the posture of a girl learning her first cutter, into the hand that lingered too long on the hilt of a blade passed down from an ancestor, into the silence between generations where a story waits to be asked for, never told outright. By the end of the Edo period, few believed such women had ever truly existed. The myths had grown too graceful, too theatrical. But in some forgotten households, there were still scars on the stone gateposts, still grooves in the floor where a polearm had been spun in training 100 red years before. There were letters hidden beneath floorboards written by women who had commanded troops, who had buried brothers, who had died with swords in their hands, and no mention in the family register. They had not disappeared. They had become legend, and the thing about legends is this: they sleep, but they do not die. The silence had lasted for 2.5 centuries, but no silence endures forever. Beneath the ornate armor of the Tokugawa peace, hairline fractures had begun to spread. Foreign ships arrived on black waves, smoke curling from their engines. Their guns aimed not in anger, but in suggestion. The Americans came first, followed by the British, the Dutch, the Russians, each bearing demands wrapped in diplomacy, each offering trade with one hand and threat with the other. Japan, long closed to the outside world, was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a prize. The shogunate faltered. Its systems, so long unchallenged, creaked under the weight of modernity. Daimyo whispered of reform. Samurai wandered in confusion, their status no longer matched by their salaries, their swords beautiful but useless in a world that now valued cannon and railways. The emperor, long a figurehead cloaked in ritual and distance, was summoned back to relevance. What followed was not a transition. It was a reckoning. The Boshin War, named for the zodiac year of its beginning, would tear the country apart one last time. And in the snowy province of Aizu, the old world prepared to make its final stand. Aizu had always been a stronghold of Tokugawa loyalty, remote, proud, and steeped in the ancient codes of Bushido. Its lords had served the shogunate with unwavering obedience, and its people had shaped their lives around duty, discipline, and silence. When war broke out between the imperial forces and the shogunate remnants, Aizu became a fortress against the tide of change. It did not rebel, it simply refused to bend. And for that, it would be crushed. The imperial army came with rifles, cannons, and banners of reform. They came not as invaders, but as liberators, so they claimed. But in Isuzu, liberation looked like siege. The walls of Suruga Castle, thick with snow and pride, became the last bastion of an era that refused to vanish quietly. Inside those walls, the samurai prepared to die, and among them were women. They were not legend, they were not symbols. They were the daughters of retainers, the wives of warriors, the sisters of boys too young to carry swords. When the call to arms came, they did not flinch. They formed a unit, small, determined, and deadly. They called themselves the Joshai, the women's army. They were led by Nano Teo, a 21-year-old woman trained in the martial arts since childhood. Her father had taught her the Naginata. Her mother had taught her calligraphy. She had studied Confucian texts, but she had also studied war. She had never expected to use that training. She had been raised in peace like every other girl of her class. But now peace had fled and the enemy stood outside the gates. She took up her blade. So did her younger sister Yuko and a small band of girls barely old enough to marry. They were not officially recognized by the Isuzu command. They were not part of any formal regiment. But they did not wait for permission. They sewed their own uniforms, simple hakama headbands marked with family crests. They armed themselves with spears, rifles, bows, and blades, and they walked into battle. It is difficult to describe what it meant in that moment on that frozen ground to see women marching out of a castle toward the gunfire. It was not theater. It was not an act of desperation. It was duty. These women had been trained not to expect battle, but to be ready for it. And now, at the edge of everything they had been told was true, they walked calmly into the storm. Teo led the charge. The imperial soldiers, shocked by the sight, hesitated. That hesitation cost them. With her naginata, she carved through the front line, cutting down 1, 2, 3 men before the fourth raised a rifle. The shot struck her in the chest. She staggered. Blood soaked her robes. She did not fall. With what strength remained, she turned to her sister, and she asked calmly, clearly, without hesitation, to be beheaded. She did not want her body desecrated. She did not want her head taken as a trophy. She wanted to die as a warrior. Her sister obeyed. It was not an act of horror. It was an act of honor. Teo's head was buried beneath a pine tree in the temple grounds near the battlefield. Her naginata laid beside her. She had died not in defiance but in fulfillment. Her life had led to this moment, and she had met it without regret. The Joshai did not survive the war. Most were killed. A few escaped. A few were captured. None were honored by the victors. Their names were not included in the imperial reports. Their deeds were not carved into monuments. But those who lived remembered. The people of Isuzu remembered. And in the years that followed, in the quiet that returned like snowfall over a burned field, the story of the women's army began to spread. Not as a tale of tragedy, but as a final testament to what it had meant to be samurai. This was not a legend polished by time. It was real. It was bloody. It was the last cry of an age that had believed with all its heart that courage could live in anyone who was willing to bear it. The Maji government, once victorious, would move swiftly to erase the past. The samurai were outlawed, their swords were confiscated, their titles stripped. Women were declared subjects, daughters of a new empire that wanted their obedience, not their blades. But somewhere in Isuzu, beneath a pine tree, a grave remained. And above it, for those who knew where to look, a spirit lingered. She had fought, she had led, and she had died on her own terms. The castle walls of Izu had held for as long as they could. With each new sunrise, the cannons roared closer. The sky above the battlements grew black with smoke and storm. Food grew scarce. Powder ran low. Children huddled in temple halls, their faces smudged with soot, their ears stopped against the endless percussion of war. Outside, the imperial forces tightened their grip like a noose pulled slowly by steady hands. The rifles had not stopped firing in weeks. The banners of the old world still flew above Taruga Castle, but they fluttered like ghosts. Inside the gates, Nanoteo stood as if carved from stone. The girl who had once studied calligraphy and strategy, who had learned the weight of a sword not from legend, but from her father's stern hand, now carried herself with the poise of a general and the serenity of one who already knew she would not survive the season. She had not asked for this war, she had not sought it out, but it had come all the same, and when it did, she had not hidden. She had walked into it with her back straight and her eyes wide open. The Joshai had become more than a unit, it was a vow made flesh. 20 to 30 women, barely trained in anything more than ceremonial drills, now stood armored and armed, having cast off the silk of their former lives in favor of steel. Some were daughters of high-ranking retainers. Some were young wives, their husbands already fallen on the field. Some were little more than girls, too young to be called women, but too old to be told to stay behind. Together they marched beneath the sky, the color of slate. They sang no songs, there were no drums, just the sound of their footsteps in the snow and the rasp of blades drawn from scabbards that had not seen daylight in 100 years. The Imperial soldiers had never seen anything like them. They expected resistance from the men. They expected stray shots from hidden windows, a last desperate stand from the wounded pride of the Tokugawa remnants. But this small force of women, moving with precision and intent, unnerved them. For a moment, that hesitation froze the front line, and Teiko struck. The naginata in her hands moved not like a weapon, but like an extension of her breath. Its curved blade caught the first soldier across the chest, tearing through cloth, bone, and muscle with the same ease she might once have used to slice through a hanging banner. She pivoted, struck again. The rhythm was relentless, her movements flowing like water over stone. She was not theatrical. There was no flourish, only purpose. Only the calm certainty of a woman who had known from the moment she picked up her blade that her life would end with it. Around her, the women of the Yoshitai followed her lead. They did not cry out. They did not retreat. The snow was kicked up with each step, each lunge, each fall. Imperial rifles returned fire. The sound was deafening, but the Joshai kept advancing. Teo fought through the pain, through the chaos, through the blood that already stained her sleeves. She moved toward the line again and again, her breath frosting in the morning air. Her eyes fixed not on the enemy, but on the future that would not have her in it. Then came the shot. A single bullet fired through the den struck her in the chest just below the collarbone. The force knocked her back. She staggered, dropped to one knee, her hand pressed to the wound, her vision swimming. And yet she did not scream. She did not weep. She looked to her sister Yuko and spoke not with fear, but with composure. She told her what must be done. Takiko did not wish to be captured. She did not wish to be defiled or made into a spectacle. She did not want her head raised on a spike or her body paraded through the streets as a curiosity. She had studied the history of women warriors. She knew what had been done to those who fell into enemy hands. And so she asked her sister with what breath remained to end it. It was not an easy thing, but Yuko obeyed. There in the snow outside Isuzu, surrounded by the dead and the dying, by the thunder of guns and the shouts of the charging line, a young girl lifted her sister's blade and fulfilled her final request. Teo's head was taken and carried not to the enemy, but to the Hokkaide temple, hidden away beneath the shadow of trees where the roar of war could not reach. Her body was buried nearby. A wooden marker, plain and weathered, was raised in her memory. There was no funeral procession, no military salute, no scrolls sent to Ado announcing her death. The shogunate had already collapsed. There were no more lords to mourn her, no more titles to bestow. But the people of Isuzu remembered. In time, the war ended. The imperial army declared victory. The Magi era began. The samurai class was dissolved. Their swords banned, their pensions cut. The emperor, now restored to power, wore Western clothes. Trains replaced processions. Schools replaced dojus. And the women who had once fought were told to forget. But the grave remained and the story spread. Not officially, not loudly, but through quiet voices passed from family to family, from teacher to student, from mother to daughter. Teko's charge became the last great act of the honor Bugisha, a final blade drawn in a world that would soon have no use for such weapons. She had not died in legend. She had died in mud and blood and smoke, but her story lived. And in every generation that followed, in every girl who walked past the old training hall and wondered what it meant to hold a naginata, in every mother who still told the story by firelight, her charge continued. She had not fought to be remembered. She had fought because it was right. She had died not as a girl, not as a wife, not as a subject of an empire, but as a warrior. And for a moment, just before the world forgot, she reminded it what a woman could be. The world that came after was clean in a way that felt unnatural. The Meiji era, born in revolution and baptized in fire, wasted no time in tearing down the world that had preceded it. It did not slowly evolve from the ash of feudal Japan. It burned the past and planted its own banners in the soil. The emperor returned to power not as the mystical, untouchable figure of old, but as a living god made visible, clothed in Western uniforms. surrounded by modern ministers, speaking in the language of railroads, factories, treaties, and steel. The country was no longer a web of samurai provinces answering to a distant shogun. It became a nation-state, unified and mechanized. A gleaming engine pointed toward the future. But engines do not run on memory, and so the past had to be forgotten. What followed was not a deliberate act of cruelty, but something quieter, something far more devastating. The Meiji government did not issue proclamations outlawing the stories of women warriors. They simply stopped speaking of them. The samurai were no longer relevant. Their titles were stripped, their privileges abolished, their sword banned from public wear. And with them went the honor buga, not dragged away in chains, but quietly set aside as though they had never existed at all. The new vision of womanhood in Meiji Japan was imported in porcelain, delicate, demure, and utterly domestic. From Britain came the ideal of the Victorian wife, soft-spoken and self-acing, the angel in the household. From China, the Confucian scholars offered a rigid hierarchy of filial piety and feminine submission, now eagerly embraced by reformers who saw the old warrior codes as barbaric and outdated. The samurai woman, once fierce and proud, became an embarrassment to the new order. She did not fit into the drawing rooms of foreign diplomats. She did not look proper beside the gentlemen in woolen suits and silk top hats, so she was rewritten. In textbooks, she vanished. In newspapers, she was never mentioned. The curriculum for girls' education focused on etiquette, sewing, modesty, and patriotic obedience. Military drills were for boys. History was for emperors and statesmen. A woman who had once commanded a garrison or defended a gatehouse was now treated as a romantic oddity, a cautionary tale, or a myth. If she was remembered at all, it was as a theatrical flourish, her blade dulled by sentiment, her resolve softened into a tragic smile. Even Nanoteo, who had died not 50 years before, was not mentioned in the official accounts of the Boshin War. Her charge had shaken the earth. Her death had been witnessed by hundreds. And yet, the reports submitted to the government made no space for her name. No medals, no gravesite honors, no posthumous recognition, only silence, long and bitter. The Meiji government's reshaping of memory was not just cultural, it was architectural. Shrines to samurai were quietly repurposed or demolished. Old castles were turned into government offices or allowed to crumble, moss-eaten and gutted. The tools of the honor buga, the naginata, the armor, the blood-slick scrolls of the Sengoku years were placed in museums behind glass. They were no longer considered tools of survival. They were art, beautiful, dead. And yet in the corners of Japan, the new government could not quite reach. In villages nestled between mountains, and in manors where the old banners still hung in secret closets, the stories did not entirely die. They were told in whispers. A grandmother might pass down a tale of a siege survived. A faded photograph might be shown to a granddaughter. The woman in it, unsmiling, dressed not in kimono, but in a simplified form of armor, her hair tied back with military precision. A sword might be discovered beneath a floorboard, rusted but not broken. And in the telling of these stories, even when half remembered and half forbidden, something stirred. But the machinery of forgetting is strong, and it works slowly, patiently, grinding down memory into sentiment until even the people who once told the stories begin to question them. Were they real? Did a woman truly command a fortress? Did she really kill a dozen men with a naginata? Or was it just a fable, a trick of folklore shaped by loss? The answer, of course, was yes. But truth without voice is as powerless as a sword buried in stone. The Meiji historians wrote with steel pens in war uniforms tailored by Europeans. They spoke of the restoration as though it had been bloodless. They spoke of modernization as though it had always been destiny. And they erased not with malice, but with indifference. The honor buga became a ghost. Her armor was hung in museums, her name reduced to 2 lines in an appendix, her story misremembered by those who feared what she might inspire. And yet she had walked, she had fought, she had lived. That could not be undone. Even as she faded from the record, her echo remained. Not in the halls of power, not in the books bound in silk and stamped by the emperor, but in the hearts of those who had heard the truth and refused to stop repeating it. The Meiji era may have declared the end of the warrior woman, but the land remembered her footprints, and it would not forget forever. Time does not move in a straight line. It loops, it drifts, it circles back to what was once forgotten, brushing dust from stone, peeling silence from names. For nearly a century after the Meiji Restoration, the story of Japan's warrior women remained buried beneath the weight of imperial ideology, foreign influence, and the delicate fiction of feminine docility. But memory, like water, finds its cracks, and in the creaking shelves of university archives, in the soil beneath long-forgotten battlefields, and in the half-remembered stories of grandmothers and temple priests, the honorabia began to stir again. It began with bones. In the mid-10th century, as Japan sought to modernize its understanding of its own past, archaeologists began excavating the sites of major Sengoku battles. These were not dramatic digs. They were quiet, methodical, unceil-braided. The purpose was academic, cataloging burial grounds, identifying remains, mapping ancient campaigns. But in the mud of Senbon Matsubara, where the Battle of Shizukatake had once raged like a wildfire, something unexpected was found. Of the skeletons recovered, a full third were determined to be female. At first, the findings were dismissed. Perhaps these were camp followers, servants, civilians caught in the crossfire. But the bodies told another story. Their bones bore the marks of trained warriors, clean fractures from swords, arrowheads lodged in ribs, arms broken in defensive positions. These were not bystanders. These were combatants, and their presence could not be ignored. More discoveries followed. Other battlefields yielded similar results. Women buried with weapons, their bodies arranged as any samurai might be, facing the east in accordance with warrior custom. The remains whispered a truth that had been erased from the pages of official history. The honorees had not been rare ornaments on the fringes of conflict. They had been present, they had fought, and they had died in the same mud as their brothers, unrecorded but unforgotten by the land. Scholars began to look deeper. Not the mainstream historians trained to recite the imperial narrative, but a handful of independent researchers, archivists, and martial arts historians, many of them women, who sensed that something was missing from the grand story of Japan's past. They combed through family records, temple ledgers, battlefield accounts that had never been fully translated. They traced the bloodlines of obscure clans and found not only stories of male generals, but of their wives and daughters who had fought beside them. Among the first to bring these stories back into the light was the historian Stephen Turnbull. In his work during the late 20th century, he made it his mission to restore the warrior women of Japan to their rightful place in history. His books, widely read in both academic and popular circles, did not romanticize the honor buga. They did not claim them to be feminist icons ahead of their time. Instead, they told the truth. These women had existed. They had trained. They had fought. They had bled. And they had been buried, both literally and metaphorically, by a culture that had no place for their kind in the new order. Turnbull's work was only the beginning. Japanese scholars followed suit, digging into local histories, oral traditions, and visual art long dismissed as fantasy. They began to reinterpret the old Emikono picture scrolls. No longer assuming every figure in armor was male, they looked at handwriting, sword forms, family letters, and training manuals passed down through female lines. Slowly a new picture emerged, not of an anomaly, but of a hidden tradition. At the same time, martial arts schools across Japan began to revisit their own legacies. In the shadow dojos, where naginata had once been taught only as a polite art of posture and balance, instructors rediscovered the original combat forms. They began to teach them as they had once been taught, aggressive, fast, lethal. Women who had grown up practicing for competition now understood they were participating in something far older and far more profound. Public consciousness followed. Documentaries aired. Museums curated exhibitions. At the grave of Nanoteo, visitors began to leave offerings. Not just flowers, but handwritten letters from schoolgirls, from tourists, from soldiers. Statues were erected. Commemorations were held. The Japanese government, long reluctant to embrace narratives that complicated its clean historical arc, quietly acknowledged the existence of these women. Not all at once, not loudly, but enough to mark a change. In 2008, Nano Teiko was finally honored by the city of Aizu. Her grave, once unmarked and largely unknown, became a site of pilgrimage. In 2017, a special cultural project designated 5 historic women, including Tomoe Gazen and Hojo Masako, as national cultural treasures, recognizing their roles in shaping the nation. The gesture was symbolic, but it meant something. It meant the doors were open again, and once opened, doors do not always close. But rediscovery is not revival. The Honogata are not returning in the literal sense. There are no more castle walls to defend, no more daimyo to swear fealty to, but their story is returning slowly, unevenly, stubbornly. It has left the stage in the scroll. It has returned to the soil in the archive. It has passed from forgotten bones to living minds. And though they will never march again, never raise banners or charge across snowy fields, their presence has become something deeper. They are no longer ghosts. They are ancestors, and they have been remembered. There is something in the land itself that remembers, not in the way people do with facts and dates, with names etched into stones or written in history books, but in the deeper memory that seeps into forests and riverbanks, into castle foundations, in temple courtyards long after the footsteps have faded. Japan is a country that has worn many masks. It has reinvented itself again and again, feudal to imperial, imperial to democratic, ancient to modern, sacred to secular. Each transformation marked by rupture and reform. And yet beneath those layers, something persistent remains. In that undercurrent, the spirit of the honor buga has never truly vanished. The women who once stood on battlefield walls and rode into combat under war banners no longer exist as a warrior class. But their legacy flows like an underground stream through the veins of modern Japanese culture. It lingers in unexpected places in martial arts schools where young women train with the naginata not only for sport, but as a ritual that connects them to a line of warriors long ignored. It breathes in museums and family archives where dusted armor is handled not as relic, but as inheritance. And it lives in the stories, some half true, others fully imagined, that continued to be told in novels, manga, television dramas, and whispered conversations between generations. The 20th century brought with it not only war and occupation, but a new lens through which women in Japan were both seen and expected to see themselves. The image of the obedient housewife was reinforced in the decades following World War II, especially under the influence of foreign reconstruction ideals and a state eager to project stability through conformity. Yet alongside this, the silent influence of the warrior woman began to resurface in ways subtle and unspoken. The figure of the strong, unwavering Japanese woman appeared not as a revolutionary, but as a memory reasserting itself, steady, capable, and enduring. In the literature of the post-war period, in the quiet resilience of survivors rebuilding a ruined nation, and even in the social movements of the late 20th century, one could feel the echo of a deeper strength, one older than any imported model of femininity. By the dawn of the 21st century, the honor bugeisha was no longer a ghost whispered about only by scholars and temple caretakers. She had returned not in armor but in recognition. Schools across Japan began to include women warriors in their history curriculum. Documentaries were aired that traced the lives of Tomoe Gazen and Nano Teo with a reverence once reserved only for their male counterparts. Monuments were restored, graves were honored. For the first time in centuries, the nation began to speak their names again, without shame, without dismissal. But the legacy of the honor buga is not merely historical, it is psychological. It speaks to what Japan has always understood in its deepest moments of peril, that when survival is at stake, the soul of the warrior is not bound by gender. This understanding has filtered into art, into philosophy, into the way young girls are taught to carry themselves with dignity and quiet power. Not all are taught to wield weapons, but many are taught to endure, to protect, to hold the line in the face of overwhelming odds, not with swords, but with resolve. In that way, the spirit of the honor buga lives on, not as a figure of rebellion, but as a form of inherited strength, passed down like an heirloom, invisible, but ever present. In modern Japan, women have taken their place in every sector of society, politics, science, business, the arts. Yet, the battle for full recognition remains as it does in every nation. And still, when faced with challenge, there are those who look back, not to foreign models or imported ideologies, but to the soil beneath their feet. There is pride in knowing that once women defended this land with their own hands, that once they stood not behind, but beside, that their strength is not a new phenomenon, but an ancient inheritance denied only by the artificial constraints of memory. And so it is that the honor Buggas once cast into shadow has become more than a figure of history. She has become a symbol, not one sculpted for propaganda or soft-focused nostalgia, but one forged in iron and fire, shaped by necessity and sealed by sacrifice. She is not venerated for beauty or for tragedy, but for what she chose to stand when others said sit, to fight when others said flee, to dome when others said wait. There is no temple large enough to house every story that was lost, no monument tall enough to name each woman who was erased. But in the hearts of a people who have begun to remember, there is room. In the rhythm of a naginata practice on a quiet evening, in the bowed heads of girls paying tribute at Nanoteo's grave, in the way mothers tell their daughters to carry themselves with strength even when they are told to be small. There the legacy remains. And as long as the mountains hold their snow, as long as cherry blossoms fall across the ruins of old castles, as long as swords lie buried in the earth, waiting to be found again, the story of the honor bug will not end. History does not remember everyone. It is not built to. It is a scaffold of convenience, a selective ledger inked by the hands of those who stood closest to power. For every warrior crowned with glory, there are 100 whose names were never written down. For every monument that rises, 100 graves remain unmarked beneath moss and time. The honor buggas, those women who fought when they were not supposed to, who bled beside their husbands and sons, who held the walls and guarded the gates and drew their last breath with a blade still in hand. Most of them are lost to the silence, but not all. In the past, remembering a name was a kind of defiance. It still is. To say the name of Tomo Gozen is to acknowledge that she lived beyond the lines of the Heike scrolls. She was not just the beautiful warrior of poems, not only a vision crafted by bars, she was real. She killed men on the battlefield. She rode through arrows and fire. She took command when others fled. And though her story has been retold so many times, it now floats somewhere between fact and myth. Still, it anchors us to a truth that she existed and that her presence was undeniable. To say the name of Nano Teo is to lift a blade on her behalf. She asked her sister to bury hers with honor, and for a time the world forgot her. But now the grave where she rests is no longer abandoned. Her name appears on school walls and history books, in the whispered prayers of girls who pass beneath her statue's gaze. She charged into the face of a nation already erasing her and left behind a silence so loud that one day people had to listen. There are other names too. Some are harder to find, scratched into family registers or hidden in letters not meant to last. There was In who defended the castle of Surasaki, dressed in full armor, rallying men twice her age when the gates were breached. There was Hungaku Gozen, who led a rebellion, her bow striking enemies from horseback until she was captured and wounded, but never broken. There were women in Isuzu who died without a single written record. Their names carried only in temple chants and family lines. These names, fragmented, blurred, half-remembered, are still names. They deserve breath. And what of the others? The ones lost completely. The unnamed daughters who took up weapons not for glory, but for duty. The wives who stood watch as their husbands fell, who lifted swords too heavy and kept swinging anyway. The sisters who bled in the snow, their bodies mistaken for men until their armor was removed. Their names may never be known, but their lives mattered. Their deaths mattered, and their silence, too, is a kind of presence. It hums beneath the surface of this story, shaping every line. To remember them now is not to rewrite history, it is to widen it. We do not remember them because they were perfect. We do not remember them because they represent some modern idea of heroism. We remember them because they fought when they were told not to. We remember them because they did what history said they could not. We remember them because they carried steel in their hands when the world told them to carry silence. And in doing so, they left behind a question that still echoes centuries later. What else have we forgotten? There is no final banner to raise, no epilogue where they are granted justice by the world that buried them. History is not a story that ends cleanly. It is a circle, always returning, always folding in on itself. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps remembering their names even now is an act of resurrection, more powerful than any statue or parade. Perhaps memory is the last battlefield and the most important one. So let us say them again softly but clearly, as if the wind itself might carry their names to where they were lost. Tomoe Gozen, Nano Teiko, Hangaku Gozen, Meirin, and all the rest whose names were taken, but whose swords still shine in the dark corners of memory. They were not supposed to exist, but they did. And now, finally, we remember. Good night. Back to top AI features. Feedback: transform your transcript with AI-powered insights. Output language: AI responses will be in this language: English, Spanish, Espanol, French, Francais, German, Deutsch, Italian, Italiano, Portuguese, Portuguese, Dutch, Netherlands, Russian, Ruski, Japanese, Riben-yu, Korean, Hangugyo, Chinese, Zhongwen, Arabic, Arabia, Hindi, Hindi, Polish, Polski, Swedish, Svenska, Norwegian, Norsk, Danish, Dansk, Finnish, Suomi, Czech, Czestina, Hungarian, Magyar, Greek, Ellinica, Hebrew, Brit, Turkish, Turkcha, Vietnamese, Tieng Viet, Tay, Aithi, Indonesian, Upan, Bahasa Indonesia, Malay, Bahasa Melayu, Ukrainian, Ukrainska, Romanian, or Romana, Bulgarian, Belgarsky, Croatian, Hrvatski, Serbian, Srpski, Slovak, Slovenčina, Lithuanian, Lietuviu, Latvian, Latvieshu, Estonian, Esti. Most used: your top 5 features based on usage. No favorites yet. Start using features and your top 5 will appear here automatically. Try a summary: popular features, viral clips, find shareable moments, long summary, comprehensive overview, key insights, main takeaways, notable quotes, memorable phrases, basic content summaries and transcripts, clean transcript, micro summary, short summary, bullet points, long summary, key insights, notable quotes, analysis, deep insights and patterns, extract ideas, extract insights, extract patterns, extract wisdom, study and education, learning and note-taking tools, flashcards, concept map, Q&A, outline notes, Cornell notes, rapid logging, T-note, method charting, method QEC, method Q&A, split page, content creation, social media and blog content, viral clips, Twitter, IDs of LinkedIn, article, Twitter, thread blog, article blog, outline, tweet ideas, LinkedIn, post, Twitter, thread, so specialized advanced analysis tools, speaker IDA checker predictions, references, Mayan idea, proper notes, generated content, AI-powered outputs from your transcript. Clear all. I'll click any AI tool above to generate content here. Finding this tool useful? Bookmark us, CMD plus C-Travel plus D for easy and fast access. Bookmark this silly little tool. Looks like you found the transcript you needed. Before you head off, did you know you can bookmark our site? Just click the star on the top bar. Use this keyboard shortcut to bookmark us Control plus D. Use this keyboard shortcut to bookmark us CMD plus D. That way, next time you need a transcript, you can find us easily without searching again. Super handy, right? Close. Disclaimer: YouTube